A young Sunday school teacher stood dead still, wide-eyed and defiant as she watched the metal object swing within millimetres of her nose. She smiled, the kind of smile that's built on relief and satisfaction. She'd won a dare with a local group of delinquents. They would only come to Sunday school if she was tough enough to not flinch while they swung this heavy weight close to her face. Much tougher than getting my kids to Sunday school. This is Mary Slessor. Tough, adventurous, determined. Having worked a 12-hour day in the jute mills from age 14 does this to you, as does a firm belief of the gospel and people's need for Jesus. Mary was born in Scotland in 1848. Her father was an unemployed alcoholic and her mother was a devout Christian. She felt a call to Christian missions at a young age, hearing her pastor regularly speak highly of missionaries, reading the journals of missionary to Africa David Livingstone. Her brother also felt this calling and vowed to be a full-time missionary. And when he died young from pneumonia, Mary resolved to fulfill this calling from the Lord. In 1876, at the age of 28, she set sail for Calabar in southeastern Nigeria, where when she arrived, she was met with chaos. Britain had colonised Nigeria, but had no concern for the welfare of the people, only for the way it helped them with their trade. And then the problems amongst the locals were crazy. Infanticide, human sacrifice still took place. Disease was rampant, and women's rights were non-existent. But tough, adventurous, determined, this was the right place for a woman like Mary. So Mary got to work sharing the gospel and caring for the most vulnerable. There was an horrific practice of killing twins because they were considered cursed. And so she took in many as her own. She would also care for the mothers of twins, to walk with them and help them enable them to still care for their children even though they'd been shunned by society. Women were also often buried alive with their husbands when their husbands died, so she worked to prevent that and care for those women. She gained respect amongst the locals by having no fear of their superstitions, of which there were many. These superstitions were just like a metal object swinging past her head. She just stared them down. Her trust in God's sovereignty was attractive and winsome, and her reliance on prayer guided her. She wrote this prayer when looking at her uphill battle. Lord, she said, the task is impossible for me, but not for thee. Lead the way and I will follow. Why should I fear? I am on a royal mission. I am in the service of the King of Kings. As Mary's ministry increased, she moved further inland, deciding to live with the tribes, not in the comfort of her missionary house. Her colleagues advised against it. Her supporters advised against it. But tough, adventurous, and determined, Mary pressed on. She made her home among the Okoyong people, and one biographer writes this: from here on, Mary allowed herself to be transformed by the people, adopting every practice of theirs that she could without giving up her faith. She even stopped dressing like a Westerner and wore tribal women's clothing. The Scottish woman was practically a native, besides her very light-coloured skin. We call this incarnational ministry. Just like Jesus was made incarnate as a man, Christians like Mary become incarnate in their communities to win them for Jesus without compromising the truth of the gospel. You take on the parts of the culture that aren't bad so that you can become like them, to share with them the truth of Jesus. Just like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 22, I've become all things to all people, that by all possible means I might save some. And in this manner, Mary worked hard to bring people to Jesus. She continued to care for women and children, having up to 12 orphans living with her at once. She helped them set up a basic economy in some of the tribes that helped to end injustice and violence and brought equality and unity and empowered workers and the most vulnerable. After a while, seeing all the great work she had done and the trust that she had gained with people, the British government actually appointed her vice consul to the area she was living. And she actually used this position to oppose British force and oppose British imperialism and advocated for the locals. She sought to transform their culture through the gospel, not abolish it, which was unheard of at the time. She continued her ministry even amongst even less reached tribes, trained younger missionaries and planted churches. She inspired people back in Scotland and was treasured by the people of Nigeria. In 1915, she was struck again with malaria and refused to go home to Scotland. She died in her mud hut, tough, adventurous, and determined, surrounded by the community and the children she had raised. They had called her, and I'll probably say this wrong, but Ika Kapuru Kapuru Wo, which means everybody's mother. And she received a hero's funeral procession. Upon her death, it was written about Mary Slessor and her mission. Yes. She who loved us, she who sought us, brought us healing, brought us comfort, brought us sunshine to our darkness. She is gone, the dear white mother. Thus she taught us and thus she laboured, living, spent herself to help us, dying, found her rest among us. Her legacy impacted the world because of her work, and many people came to Christ. Human dignity was restored. Many people were inspired to become missionaries, and she even taught the British how to cherish the Nigerian people. What inspires me about Mary is that she was a single woman, tough, adventurous, and determined, in a time when women weren't encouraged to be any of those things. She had a firm trust in God and His truth and never let go of it or compromised it. She managed to share the gospel faithfully while still bringing about social reform. She helped the local people without patronizing them or abolishing their culture. She was like Jesus. She took on their flesh and lived among them. She practiced grace and truth and loved them to the end. May the Lord stir our hearts to go and do the same.